Hello there, and welcome to the Archive in Between, where I read stories collected from across the dimensions. Take a subscription so you can find me again if you wander off. Today's story is called Love Conquers All by ApocalypseOwl on Reddit. She had given up hope a long time ago. He'd gone missing all of the sudden. His car was just found out by the lake where he usually went fishing. It had been unlocked, door open, his fishing gear just lying on the floor. They'd searched for him for days in the forest, fearing the worst. At least he had a life insurance, so she, his widow, and the kids didn't have to suffer more from his supposed death. She had raised the kids, strong and determined, being there for them as they grew up. She had raised them right, as she and her husband had planned. But when the youngest child moved out for college, about a decade after her husband vanished, she did not expect to get summoned into some magical world the moment she was alone. A world where she was declared the prophesied heroine, who'd destroy the Demon King. It was similar to the tabletop games she'd played back when she and her husband had gone to the same college. Elves, wizards, dwarves, and a lot of sharp medieval weaponry. Being typically a barbarian during those games, she found the biggest and most fearsome-looking warhammer, along with some armor, and used both well. And, as the various wizards and elves explained the situation, got her up to speed about the world she had been summoned into, she got a strange sense of familiarity from the Demon King. The more she heard about him, the more he seemed like one of her husband's, a perpetual DM, big bads. The feudal society that summoned her was at war with this Demon King, and he threatened their ways, their kingdoms, overturning old rules, slaying countless people with his armies, overruling ancient rights that the nobility had. She did not ask what those rules were, but she didn't like how her summoners spoke of them. Made her think of people who, in reference to that civil war some 150 years ago, spoke of states' rights. To which she'd ask them, a state's rights to what? Her suspicions were confirmed when, at the first battle she had with the forces of this Demon King, she finds that the orcs and ogres hold aloft a banner of her husband's design. Even more so, the evidence is damning when their battle cry is, for King Ewan, since that is her husband's first name. She slays the soldiers with her mighty warhammer, but spares those that surrender. To her abject horror, she saw her erstwhile allies slaughter the surrendering enemies. They claimed to her that the enemy are unnatural, prone to trickery and lies. She found this to be unlikely. If her husband leads the enemy forces as the Demon King, then they cannot be entirely evil. Her meek, friendly, polite husband, a man who is loving and fair. Never has he raised a voice in anger. Never has he shown a temper. He is not the stuff which evil overlords are made of. She was always the bigger woman, in a literal sense. Stronger, fiercer, taller, more aggressive, and more temperamental. He was gentle, where she was filled with wrath. She had a raging fire in her, and he was like water, gentle and calming. If anybody ever asked why she'd settled for him, she'd have first of all had a hard time not decking them in the face for implying that her husband was anything other than a wonderful catch. Then she'd probably had said that it was because they'd always been friends. She'd protected him when he was a kid, and they'd always played together. Eventually, when they went to college together, they started getting warm feelings for each other and dated. She was far more suited for a dark overlord than he was. She wasn't jealous, but she certainly was surprised. So she decided that if the people who summoned her were so adamant on the man being a Demon King, she'd have to see for herself. Packing a few supplies, she went off to meet the Demon King for herself. She left her summoners without telling them, to see if that sweet little man really had become a Demon King. Traveling through enemy lands, she did see bad things. POW camps, prisoners of war forced to work at building roads paved with cobblestone from town to town. She saw great obsidian statues depicting a human man who looked exactly like her dear husband. She saw officers of the side she had been summoned by being sacrificed in temples or executed by hanging. But she also saw much good. State-funded orphanages where children of all races played together. Every town she passed had schools, apothecaries, and homeless shelters, all funded with taxpayer money. Town police kept safety of law, even if the law seemed draconian to her. To fund her travels, she took on quests for the guards and joined the government-supported Adventurers Guild, where evil and feral monsters were hunted, alongside outlaws and bandits. When she finally came to the capital of the Demon King Yuan's empire, she had to admit it did look imposing, with its high towers and stern gates, from which guards clad in black steel armor with long blades stood watch. They kept close watch on the comings and goings into the walled city. But once inside, it was remarkable. The city was extremely cosmopolitan for a fantasy realm. There you might find an elven cafe next to an orc bar. Across the street you could find a gnoll tattoo parlor or a dwarven blacksmith. She was duly impressed by just how peaceful and orderly the city seemed. There were fashion shops, even some that catered to women made pretty much exclusively of muscle, like her. There were theaters, inns, hotels, and oddly even sushi bars. But in the center of the city there stood a black citadel, looming and terrible, its sharp towers, like jagged teeth, extended into the heavens. Its black stones were oily and strangely cold to the touch, but she knew that if the Demon King was truly her husband, which seemed incredibly likely, she'd find him in there. And if he wasn't, well, she could get the quest over with. Knowing that there wasn't a snowball's chance in hell for her to sneak inside, she played the oldest trick in the infiltration book. She used her meager funds to buy an old toolkit and a large workman's uniform, and simply walked inside without anyone batting an eye. It always works. Inside, she searched for Yuan, asking some guards for the way to the royal bedchambers, saying that there was some floorboards that needed work. They politely told her the exact directions, which she found somewhat distressing. If Yuan actually was here, with guards like that, an assassin with some sense could have taken him out years ago. She finally came to the room, and, trembling, she opened the door. Inside was a simple double bed, some work tables, a wooden office chair, and Yuan, sitting in it and reading a book. He didn't so much as glance at her when she entered. She thought at first he hadn't noticed her, but without turning to look, he spoke. "I was not aware we needed a carpenter today, but what my guards hear, I hear. A very capable spell. So why don't you tell me why you're really here?" As he said that, from the room what seemed like roots grew out and grabbed her arms and legs to hold her safe. But she was faster and stronger. Instead, she jumped ahead and turned the chair around, making Yuan face her. All color drained from his face. "Sandra, what are you doing here?" Smiling at him, she lifted him up into an embrace. "Been too long, Yuan." He was still surprised, but reacted almost instinctively towards feeling his wife holding him again. "How did you get here? The warlocks who summoned me told me that they couldn't summon more people." She sat him down and kissed him gently on the cheek. "Your enemies, Yuan. They want me to stop you. Summoned me here because they said I was the only one capable of stopping you." He was shocked. Are you going to stop me?" he asked with great worry in his voice. She looked at him, and with her large hand she grasped his. "You're doing some things I don't like, I'll have to admit it, but I don't care about their prophecies. That other side, your enemies, well, I haven't seen much of their society, but what you are making here, that is good, though it can be better. If I have to save the world from you, I will save it from the things you have wrought which are wrong, but not remove you." He nodded and embraced his wife. To the world, she was proclaimed his queen soon after, and together they made peace with Yuan's enemies, a peace which forced them to relinquish certain rights in exchange for keeping their lands. No more prima nocta, no more serfdom. They had to agree, For who could stand against the demon king and his wife, the heroine? Many of his more brutal rules were, by his wife's insistence, lessened. No more human sacrifice, no more executions for minor crimes. Together they ruled, the big, imposing barbarian heroine and her wizard husband, as king and queen. And though they were old, indeed close to the moments when children could no longer be made, in that magical realm they had one final child, a girl who would inherit the wisdom and knowledge of her father, and the physical attributes and determination of her mother. When she took over the throne, she completed her father's work, and united the continent, and ruled justly, though not without her challenges, for many years. But the story of Princess, later Queen Alicia, and her war against the Nightspawn, or her quest to free her husband, the dragon Arvalane, from the Void Tower, those are stories for another time. Thanks for stopping by and listening to the story. Take a subscription. It'll lead you back if you get lost, and it'll let you know when I'm ready to read again. If you have any ideas about what I should read next, let me know in the comments, and I'll try to get the author's permission if I don't have it already. With that, I must bid you farewell, but I look forward to seeing you again when it's time for me to tell another tale.